Hello, my darling, and welcome to our story time. For the 12 days of Christmas, our next story is Christmas Day by Anna Morrison. And we have our warm and toasty fireplace to keep us cozy while I read to you. If you like what you hear, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. You can also become a supporter of mine on Anchor. All links can be found in the description below. And now, on with our story time. Boys, said Mrs. Howard one morning, looking up from a letter she was reading. I have a letter from your grandmamma. She writes that she is returning to England shortly. The boys went on with their breakfast without showing any great amount of interest in this piece of news, for they had never seen their grandmother, and therefore could not very well be expected to show any affection for her. Now Mrs. Howard, the mother of two boys and aunt to the third little fellow, was a widow and very poor, and often found it a hard task to provide for her three boys, as she called them. For having adopted her little orphan nephew, she always treated him as her own son. She had sometimes thought it strange that old Mrs. Howard should not have offered to provide for Leslie herself, but she had never done so, and at last Mrs. Howard had ceased to expect it. But now, right at the end of her letter, Grandmamma Howard wrote, I have been thinking that perhaps it would come a little hard on you to support not only your two boys, but poor Alice's son. And so, on my return to England, I propose, if you are willing, to adopt one of them, for I am a lonely old woman, and shall be glad of a young face about me again. After thinking the matter over, Mrs. Howard decided she would say nothing about their grandmother's intention to the boys, as she thought it was just possible she might change her mind again. Time passed on, and winter set in, and full of the delights of skating, the boys forgot all about the expected arrival of their grandmother. During the Christmas holidays, the boys one morning started off to Broom Meadow for a good day's skating on the pond there. They carried their dinner with them, and were told to be sure and be home before dark. As they ran along the frosty road, they came suddenly upon a poor old woman, so suddenly that Leslie ran right up to her before he could stop himself. The old woman grumbled about lazy, selfish boys, only thinking of their own pleasure, and not caring what happened to a poor old woman. But Leslie stopped at once and apologized, in his polite little way, for his carelessness. I am sorry, he said. I hope I did not hurt you, and you have had such heavy parcels to carry. Won't you let me help you? Oh, come on, Leslie, said his cousins. We shall never get to the pond at this rate. Yes, go on, said the old woman sharply. Your skating is of a great deal more importance than an old woman. But Leslie's only answer was to take the parcels and trudge merrily along beside his companion. On the way to her cottage, the old woman asked him all sorts of questions about himself and his cousins, and then, having reached her cottage, dismissed him with scarcely a thank you for the trouble he had taken. But Leslie did not take this to heart. He raced along, trying his hardest to overtake his cousins before they reached the pond, and was soon skimming about with the rest of them. Squire Leoholm, in whose grounds the boys were skating, afterwards came down to the pond to watch the fun, and being a kind-hearted old gentleman, offered to give a prize of new pair of skates to the boy who would win the greatest number of races. As it was getting late, it was arranged that the racing should come off on the following day, and the squire invited all of the boys who took part in it to come up to his house to a substantial tea after the fun was over. How delighted Leslie was, for he was a first-time skater, and he did want a new pair of skates. But the squire's skates were not to be worn by him, for on the following day, as he and his cousins were on their way to the pond, they came across the strange old woman whom they had met on the previous day. She was sitting on the ground and seemed to be in great pain. The boys stopped to ask what ailed her, and she told them that she had slipped and twisted her foot, and was afraid that her ankle was sprained, for she could not bear to place it on the ground. "Don't sit here in the cold," said Leslie. "Come, try to get up, and I will help you home." "Oh, Leslie," cried both of his cousins, "don't go. You will be late for the races and lose your chance of the prize." Poor Leslie! He turned first red, then white, and then said in a husky tone of voice, "Never mind, you go on without me." "You're a good laddie," said the old woman. "Will you be very sorry to miss the fun?" Leslie muttered something about not minding too much, and then the brave little fellow set himself to help the poor woman home as gently and tenderly as he could. She would not let him come inside with her, but told him to run off as quickly as he could, and perhaps, after all, he would not be too late for the skating. But Leslie could not bear to leave her alone and in pain, so he decided to run home and fetch his aunt. When Mrs. Howard arrived at the cottage, you can think how surprised she was to find that Leslie's poor old woman was none other than Grandmother Howard herself, who, wishing to find out the real characters of her grandsons, had chosen to come in this disguise to the little village where they lived. You will easily guess which of the three boys the grandmother chose to be her little companion. And oh, what a lovely grandmother she was, as not only Leslie, but his cousins too found out. She always seemed to know exactly what a boy wanted, and still better, to give it to him. Walter and Stanley often felt terribly ashamed of the selfish manner in which they had behaved, and wished they were more like Leslie. But their grandmother told them that it was never too late to mend, and they took her advice, and I am quite sure that at the present moment, if they were to meet a poor old woman in distress by the roadside, they would not pass her by, as they once did their grandmother Howard. And this, my darling, ends our reading of today's story. As always, have very sweet and creepy dreams. Good night.